271. Permissiveness and Class. Chalcedon Report number 67, March the 1st, 1971. American Indians are the subject of much romance as well as much prejudice, so that it is often difficult to make a realistic appraisal of their cultures. So much in Indian history suggests remarkable abilities. Men like Joseph Brant, Tecumseh, Chief Joseph, and others were clearly men of rare abilities. On the other hand, despite evidences of a superior genetic inheritance, Indians are on the lowest level of American society all too often. Very early, Indians showed an amazing case of adaptability. They recognized the horror Europeans in America felt towards their cannibalism and torture, and they steadily took on the mores of their surrounding settlers. They usually showed, however, an inability to unite. They were divided into hostile and warring tribes, and within each tribe the various bands were often more uncongenial to one another than to the European settlers. Then, too, despite their intelligence and ease at adaptation, they failed to develop beyond a certain point, and, in all too many cases, became a part of the lowest class in American life. It is important for us to understand a central cause of this failure, because it is very closely related to the rapid slide of all America and Western civilization into a lower class status. Indian cultures had a fairly uniform concept of child-rearing. As Wallace has noted of the Seneca Indians of the colonial era, early observers noted that parental tenderness was carried to a dangerous indulgence. Punishment was lacking, and mothers were quick to express resentment of any constraint or injury or insult offered to the child by an outsider. Moreover, such control as a child obtained over its excretory functions was achieved voluntarily, not as a result of consistent punishment for mistakes. Early sexual curiosity and experimentation were regarded as a natural childish way of behaving, out of which it would, in due time, grow. Page 35. Freedom was important to the Senecas and other Iroquois. The intolerance of externally imposed restraints, the principle of individual independence and autonomy, the maintenance of an air of indifference to pain, hardship, and loneliness, all these were the negative expression, as it were, of the positive assertion that wishes must be satisfied, that frustration of desire is the root of all evil. Anthony F.C. Wallace, The Death and Rebirth of the Seneca, New York, New York, Alfred A. Knopp, 1970, page 74, italics added. The situation has not greatly changed since then, as I can witness, having spent 8.5 years on an Indian reservation among two Western tribes. I never saw a frustrated Indian child. Perhaps an Indian baby cried at some time, but I cannot recall it. The baby or child was fed when it wanted to be fed. It was not denied, but was rather indulged at every turn. The love for and delight in children was real and sometimes moving, although it was obvious how unhappy the consequences of that indulgent love were. I found the Indians a lovable people, of real ability and more than a little charm, but the permissiveness of their society guaranteed their continuing unhappy and low estate. An unfrustrated child is inescapably in for trouble. It is impossible to live in a fallen world where conflict of wills is a daily problem, and a minor one in the face of our major world and local problems, without having frustrations. Discipline in childhood is a schooling in frustration and a training in patience in work. Discipline not only prepares us for frustration, but gives us the character to work towards overcoming frustration. Permissiveness in child-rearing thus avoids frustrating the child only to ensure continual frustration for the adult. The reaction of the Indian to frustration from very early times was escapism, and alcoholism was a major form of such a retreat. The more the Indian met frustration, the more readily he became an alcoholic. It was at the request of Indian leaders who were aware of their people's weakness that prohibition of liquor for Indians, now repealed, was legislated at the beginning of the last century. In American society at large today, the same permissiveness in child-rearing prevails. Earlier, alcoholism was more often linked, among white Americans, to an intense perfectionism. Such alcoholics were, or are, very capable, hard-working men, frustrated because they make too great a demand of themselves and life. Now, increasingly, the alcoholic is a product of permissiveness, of his or her inability to accept a world of frustration and overcome it. Instead of too much drive, it reveals a lack of drive. Similarly, sexual immorality was, and is, a serious problem in Indian life. Indians who deplore it are often guilty of it, but they find themselves too weak of will to maintain the standard of fidelity they admit is best. As a result, Indian family life is regularly shattered by dissension and conflict. The inability to deny themselves leads to greater unhappiness and frustration. Increasingly, too, American life as a whole sees a like pattern. Permissiveness in the home, church, and school has created an undisciplined people who feel that freedom is license and that degeneracy is health. A popular singer expressed the feeling of the age in a half-sobbing song which said at one point, "Don't deny me." A common consequence of permissive societies is a high suicide rate. Suicide is the ultimate in self-frustration. Anyone who has talked with would-be suicide knows how intense their self-pity is. Sometimes their problems are very real, and at other times appallingly trivial. In either case, there is an inability to accept frustration and an overwhelming self-pity that life should bring them to such a pass. Suicide is historically very common among American Indians, and some have seen this as evidence that their origin is in the Orient. Rather, it is a mark of their permissive culture, and as religious faith has declined in Western civilization, and as a permissive, humanistic society has grown, suicide has increased. A permissive society lacks the capacity to overcome problems because it retreats into liquor, narcotics, peyote among the Indians, sexual immorality, and a criminal and revolutionary rage whenever frustrated. Dr. Nathan Ackerman, whose viewpoint is not ours, in commenting on the Great Depression, remarked, "In those days, regardless of impoverishment, there was more constraint of behaviour. I cannot imagine looting 35 years ago. Despite want, the pattern of authority prevailed. Today, those standards have exploded. Looting and rioting have become sanctioned behaviour in many communities." Studs Terkel, Hard Times, An Oral History of the Great Depression, New York, Pantheon Books, 1970, page 219. We thus have today a more affluent society than ever before, yet less capable of accepting frustration than ever before. As a result, we now have what Dr. Gunther Stent has called a view of the end of progress. Progress is an impossibility where there is no patient work to overcome obstacles and to improve on things. Both revolutionary rage and narcotics represent forms of escapism, of a refusal to cope with problems constructively, and both are evidences of a lower-class mentality. One of the problems facing anyone who works with people today, young and old, is this radical lack of discipline and a lack of ability to meet frustrations realistically and to overcome them. The desire of most people is to walk away from problems. But nothing does more to increase the problems inherent in a society and constant to a man's life than the refusal to meet them head-on and then work patiently to overcome them. To ask for a trouble-free, unfrustrated life is to ask finally for death, and before death, a lower-class slave status. Slavery has been a constant problem in history. Many slaves have been victims of kidnapping and war, but many more have been victims of their own demand for security. As Sir William M. Ramsay long ago pointed out, the Romans wanted slavery. Serfdom began on the imperial estates. The paternal government was, quote, salvation, end quote. In fact, the entire concept of salvation was, in essence, a form of slavery to the emperor. The, quote, salvation, end quote, of Jesus and Paul was freedom. The, quote unquote, salvation of the imperial system was serfdom. Sir W. M. Ramsay, The Bearing of Recent Discovery on the Trustworthiness of the New Testament, London, England, Hodder and Stoughton, 1920, pages 109 to 198. This is no less true today. The salvation of modern man is some form of socialism, some form of slavery to the state. The state is asked to guarantee man against frustrations and is giving increasing powers for that purpose. The more the state does, however, the deeper the discontent grows, because a permissive culture intensifies frustration as it increases gratification, because it thereby decreases man's ability to bear up under any kind of inhibition or trouble. Today, people increasingly, quote, fall apart, end quote, under less and less tension and trouble. Like the Senecas, they see frustration of desire as the root of all evil, and, short of becoming themselves God, they are inescapably doomed to frustration by their human estate. Christian reconstruction thus begins in the home with godly discipline. The influence of biblical law on Hebrew life and society was an important factor in their society, and the lingering respect for and obedience to that law has given Jews an advantage in Western history. The advantage of that law of discipline was once basic to all Western civilization, but it is now being rapidly eroded. An upper class is a product of a law and discipline which gives it a practical, future-oriented perspective. Too often, however, such a class, having arrived at power, seeks, quote, liberation, end quote, from discipline by living for the moment, by treating immorality as a prerogative of wealth and power. As a result, it cuts the vital nerve of its power and rapidly declines into a lower-class mentality, which is easily toppled by any serious challenge. Wallace reports that, in 1657, the Jesuit chronicler of the Iroquois mission wrote, "There is nothing for which these peoples have a greater terror than restraint." Page 38. Much the same can be said of modern man today. Freedom is seen as freedom from law, not freedom under law. Man's life then becomes a study in irrelevance, in an evasion of reality, because his concept of freedom is destructive and negative, not positive and constructive. Not truth, but satisfaction then concerns man. Edward Dalberg, in The Carnal Myth, 1968, wrote, "Ultimately, it is only style that is important." This is a concept of writing with Dalberg. With many, it is the program for life. Thus, in fine style, they march towards death and the ultimate frustration. Let the dead bury the dead. Those who self-consciously make themselves a lower class encumber the earth. They are suicidal, and they shall perish. Meanwhile, there is a social order to be reconstructed, frustrations to overcome, troubles ahead to be met and solved, and much hard work to do. This is a way of life, and of true joys also. Those who run out on problems have abandoned life. Have you? The implications of this came to focus not too long ago on a television program. The Master of Ceremonies was talking to young schoolchildren, asking each in turn what they considered the best age to be. When he came to one little girl and asked, "And what age would you like to be?" she answered, "A baby." The surprised Master of Ceremonies asked, "Why?" "Because then people do everything for you." This is the modern dream, and even little children have caught it, to be an unfrustrated modern baby in a totally permissive world. A neighbour of an internationally famous film director currently in America reported that it was not the nude sunbathing or strolling which surprised her at this beach colony. The surprise was in other areas. The totally nude young mistress of the film director sunbathes with a pacifier in her mouth. At least the builders of Babel said, "Go to, let us build us a city and a tower." Genesis chapter 11, verse 4, the city of man. The builders of the modern Babel are working instead to build the city of the baby, the kingdom of the child. They are working to create a social order which will serve as a grand pacifier for all our self-made babies. So, you don't like problems, troubles and frustrations? Join the babies. You will have lots of company. And buy yourself a pacifier and go to bed. Get out of the way. The rest of us have work to do.